peak, but there might be some like coming and going. So
No, I totally get
the
it.
numbers. If you see a mass
stuff.
exodus, it doesn't mean
Right.
don't take it personally.
I'll blame it on Matt.
Right, absolutely. It's so nice to have a
and Matt, you get to do that likewise. Mutually assured destruction. It's great.
Absolutely. So I've been pitching everybody this event, like watch me try to hold Peter Ho Davies up, you know, like see if we can get something done here.
I feel like it's a celebrity death match. It's like 2 revision books enter, 1 revision book leaves. That's the way I want to think about it.
We've got like a lot of emails from all over the country of people coming to this
wow.
because of you guys' promotion, which is awesome. They're excited. So
that's a nice part about these Zoom events, right? It really is just great to,
exactly. Yeah,
and I have the visual, Matt. We could just get.
Oh, nice. Yes.
I'll have the visual too. Very cool. Okay, I'll go ahead and get started. Then we'll just do it with an introduction. And we'll get to things in a few minutes. All right, so I want to thank everybody for coming to our first event of the Celebration of Literary Arts for Des Moines Area Community College. We have a different format this year. We used to just do a few days in the spring, more of a festival atmosphere. And then during the pandemic, we had a reading series, a weekly reading series all spring semester. But now we're expanding all year, and it's our 20th year of the event. So this is our inaugural kickoff with Matt Bell and Peter Ho Davies. So if you haven't been here before, we'll just kind of give a rundown of the hour. We're going to start with a brief introduction and a small conversation. Then each of our writers will read for 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll end with a Q&A. So that's where you come in. We have a live chat, so feel free to comment or highlight things from the event as it's going on, or ask questions. Or we have a Q&A drop box if you want a little more privacy, and we will try to get to all of those questions before we leave. I do want to thank a couple people for putting this event on. We have Jim Stick from the Department of Liberal Arts, who has been super supportive for the last 2 decades of Celebration of Literary Arts. And we would like to thank Beaverdale Books, our local bookstore, who's supplying all the materials for our event as well for the last 2 decades. All right, so I'll begin with our introductions, and we'll start with Matt Bell, whose most recent books are Appleseed, a New York Times notable book, and a craft book entitled Refuse to be Done, a guide to novel writing, rewriting, and revision. He is also the author of the novel Scrapper and In the House Upon the Dirt Between the Lake and the Woods, as well as a short story collection, A Tree or a Person or a Wall. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, Esquire, Tin House, Fairy Tale Review, American Short Fiction, and Orion, and many others. A native of Michigan, he teaches creative writing at Arizona State University. He will be joined by Peter Ho Davies, whose most recent books are the novel A Lie Someone Told You About Yourself, longlisted for the Aspen Words Literary Prize, and The Art of Revision, The Last Word, his first work of nonfiction. His previous novel, The Fortunes, was a New York Times notable book, and his first novel, The Welsh Girl, was a London Times bestseller and longlisted for the Booker Prize. He's also published 2 short story collections, The Ugliest House in the World and Equal Love, finalists for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. His work has appeared in Harper's, The Atlantic, Paris Review, The Guardian, and Washington Post, among others, and it's been anthologized in the O. Henry Awards and Best American Short Stories. In 2003, Grantham magazine named him among its best of young British novelists, and he's won the PEN Malamud and PEN Macmillan Awards. Born in Britain to Welsh and Chinese parents, he now makes his home in the US, and he's currently on the faculty at the University of Michigan. So I just want to thank you both for joining us. And Matt, you've been here before, and it's so nice to have you again. And it's so nice to meet you for the first time, Peter.
Great to be here, Mark. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mark.
So I want to start us off. Part of the reason for the pairing of you guys, not only because you're generous people and great teachers and wonderful writers, which are our 3 criteria to invite writers here, but we also have 2 craft books that are out this year. Matt thinking about novel writing as a process, and Peter thinking about revision as a process. So I was curious if we could start off with Matt, maybe thinking about your book and how you claim it's 3 drafts or 3 phases of the novel writing process. And I was curious about what inspired you to have that structure, or what made you want to write this book in the first place?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much. And thanks to everybody who's here today. I really think it kind of came out initially just out of my own sort of novel writing process. I wrote a couple novel drafts like before I went to grad school that I never showed anybody. I sort of knew they were like early work as I was doing them. When I finished the first draft of my novel In the House Upon the Dirt Between the Lake and the Woods, I knew I'd written a novel length manuscript, but it was clearly not a book, right? That sort of like gap between those two things, that it was not even close, really. And I realized that I didn't really know how to revise something that size, that I had always been required to revise in school, but had maybe not really been taught how. It's sort of like you go to workshop and you take what you hear and you make another version or something. And so it's the sort of 3 stages of Refuse to Be Done, which just briefly for people who are here, sort of like a discovery phase where you're making the raw material of a draft. A second draft that I think of is like narrative revision, where you're really trying to get the plot and the structure and sort of the best it can be. And then a polishing revision for this third draft or third stage, where you're making the turn from like yourself to the reader. You're making the reader-based sort of version of the book. It's really the kind of path that I took through that first 1.5 cents. So in some ways, it's less like this is ideal for everybody, but more like this has worked for me 3 times, which is probably not as good of a sales pitch. But I do think a lot of people work in similar stages and in similar paths, and hopefully it's at least a way of making the task of writing a novel, which is so big, into more like smaller achievable chunks, which I really think is the key for me, that like on any given day, your task is not to write a novel, right? It's to do some other smaller work.
Yeah. Thinking about your book too, Peter, who, you're also thinking about revision, a topic that's not often dissected as well as it probably should be, even though it's often the goal of writing classes and workshops. So I was curious about what inspired you to approach this topic in a series of essays, and can you kind of explain how you see the difference between like generating material and like revisiting that material?
That's a great question. First of all, I should say I'm a huge admirer of Matt's book. It's one of those funny things, right, where it feels like you wait, all your writing life for a good book about revision, and then it's like buses and 2 come at the same time, right? And my experience of reading Matt's book was very much to be like, oh yeah, I agree with that. And oh, he said it better than me. So there was a lot of that go back and forth in that process. So it's just so much fun to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity. I think very much, I was nodding along when Matt was talking about sort of borrowing from our own experience. So that's somewhere where my book's coming from as well. I thought I'd talk a little bit actually about revision. I call it sometimes an invisible art, because we don't often have access to other people's revision processes, right? We often see finished drafts, but we don't really get to see the long and arduous process that gets people to that point. And of course, I think that's true. I think it's one of the difficulties for our understanding of revision. But it's also my excuse for mostly talking about my own work in the book, right? Because I have access to it. I can see that revision process in all its sort of warty kind of glory, I suppose. In a way, that distinction between generation and revision is one that, in a strange way, I try to sort of push back on a little bit in the context of the book, just because I think one of the hardest things about revision is that there's often a kind of barrier to it that we encounter, right? There are lots of reasons for that, but we tend to get stuck after that first draft. I think partly it's a psychological test, right? That we, to acknowledge that we need to move into revision, we also have to acknowledge there's something wrong with this draft, which is never a fun thing to get into, right? There's also that sense in which if we acknowledge there's something wrong with this draft, we have to do another one. We also have that fear that maybe there'll be something wrong with the next draft as well. So we're confronting that sort of idea of failing, although we might, take heart from that idea of failing better and back its construction of the whole thing as well. And so one of the ways I try to break down that line in the sand between the often, as we imagine it, the fun, creative draft, and then that feeling that sometimes later drafts can feel a bit like they're a chore, which I think is a throwback to the way we've often been taught about revision at a grammatical level just in high school, is to say that even first drafts in a way are revisions, right? We're already revising. If we write anything that comes from our lived experience, we write anything that comes from research that we've done, something based on somebody else's life, something that's responding to a previous narrative or genre that we've read, we're in some sense in a dialogue. We're revising something that we've remembered, that we've researched, that we've read previously in various ways. So there's the argument I'm trying to make here is there's a continuity in this process. It's not just there's a big line in the sand between one process and the next. And I think that sometimes makes the mystery of revision feel a little bit more accessible to people. You're already doing it, is the argument I want to make, even in that first draft.
That's really interesting. I love that idea. It's often what we all tell our students is like, when you're having writer's block and you're kind of like not generating material, you are writing, you just aren't putting things on the page maybe.
Mhm.
So I love that idea. Speaking of rewriting, both of you guys have addressed the idea of like, when you revise, you don't just go back and tinker with retroactively what's already there. Both of you have the philosophy of like really rewriting instead of just revising. And Matt, one of your whole sections of your book, part 2, is thinking about the rewriting process. And so can you talk a little bit about the literal rewriting of the novel that you go through and how that helps?
Yeah. As you were talking, I was like, how did I come up with doing that? Like, when did I first do it? But I think it was like maybe just like desperation. Like, this is at least something you can be doing. But since that first novel, my process for everything, short stories, essays, like, this is just one of the ways I think is to literally sort of rewrite the whole book. And so I'm not an outliner. I really struggle to work, at least in my outline for the first draft. The outline doesn't work for me as a generative tool in a first draft. I want to explore more sort of free form in the book. And I very often know very little about what I'm doing when I start a book. So I can't outline. But what I do when I have a finished draft is I outline the first draft that I've written. And I make then kind of this map of the book. And I revise that outline into a plan for like a better version of the book. And then I rewrite from scratch toward that outline. And that's worked really well for me. And one of my sort of rules that I came up with, again, I think that first book, and maybe I heard it somewhere else, but I feel like I just got lucky, is that I've long had like 2 monitors at home, and I throw up the old draft on the second monitor. I'm gesturing at my second monitor. And I call it the diminishing draft. And I let myself use things from it, but I make myself retype them. No copying, pasting. The copying, pasting is not revision. You will copy and paste a bad scene or bad prose, but I don't think you'll retype it. And so as I'm retyping, I'm moving toward the outline. I'm using what I can from the first draft, but I'm always rewriting or sort of retesting it that way. And then hopefully moving toward a better version of the book. And that's taken me about the same amount of time to write as the first draft every time. So if it takes me 10 months to write a first draft, it takes me 10 months to do that. And I think it puts you in confrontation with every word, right? You can't skim it, you can't skip it, you have to sort of physically remake it. And in doing so, you're continuing to sort of test it. I also think tons of what's in your first draft you don't really remember by the time you get to the end of it. Like I can't hold 300 pages in my head except by like trickery. There's a couple of things I can do for a very short period of time to do it. So the rewriting is also a way of doing that. To say really briefly, I'll get out of Peter's way. Amy Tan talks about rewriting as like writing in the voice of all that happened. And I find that really useful, that you start out with this other voice that's like the voice trying to figure out what happened. And at the end, you get to write with the knowledge of everything that happened in the book. And I find that to be sort of the pleasure. I find that second draft actually to be the most pleasurable draft. Like I know what I'm doing. I'm making a good version of the thing. I've learned so much from writing the first draft. I think the second draft is the one that feels like writing a book to me, like the way I think people think writing a book should feel like.
Yeah. And Peter, you had a similar idea. One of your essays, you were talking about like typewriters.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. I love that quote, that Amy Tan quote, Matt. I just really dig that. And I actually talk a little bit about Amy and technology, right? So we talk a little bit about the transition and the ways our cultural thinking about revision has changed with different writing technologies. And in the old school way, and actually I'm having a little bit of dual monitor envy, Matt, as you're talking about this. But even though you've got up-to-date technology dealing with that, there's a certain sense, I think, that it's replicating an old school vision, right? That rewriting from scratch. I think people would roll, the paper into the typewriter. They'd have a pile of pages. They could point to that and go, "That is draft number 1," and then they would roll a blank page in for the next draft. They start over again, and by the end of that, they'd have another pile of papers, and they could say, "That is draft number 2." But because most of us now, and I think of Amy Tan because she's famously an early adopter of word processing technology. Most of us now work on the computer. We're sort of making revisions as we go on the fly. So there's a certain sense in which even our language of discrete drafts begins to become less reliable, less trustworthy, because there's a certain sense in which we are constantly revising the draft before us. Is sort of an infinite draft, I think, in certain ways. But what I really like about the strategy that Matt's describing is that you get to do a little bit of separation in those regards. I have to admit, I admire Matt's strategy, and I'm a little too lazy to activate it, right? I, like many of my students, am really tempted to engage in that. Oh, I'll change a thing here, I'll drop into the narrative here, I'll try and fix a trouble spot in these regards, which is tricky. I often describe that as kind of the United Nations vision of revision, because it's like dropping into a trouble spot. Then you fix something that it has global ramifications that you may haven't entirely thought into, I think, in various ways. So I'm often toggling between those two spaces. I mean, I guess to paraphrase or to riff off what Matt is saying, that rather than revise, we should rewrite. I think for me, maybe not rather than revise, but as an important part of the revision process, for me, it's rereading, re-seeing the text, I think, in certain ways, and almost returning to it not as its writer who thinks he knows what it means or what it's about, but as its reader trying to discover what it means and where it's going, which I think is very much like that discovery mode that Matt is describing as well. And some of that is even just a re-seeing. So one of the mechanisms that I sometimes do, and a number of writers I know engage in this, which is a kind of an approximation of that separation of different drafts. It's not just to do it on different screens or to do it with different piles of TypeScript, but even to say, I will read it aloud to myself. I will start by doing it longhand, and then I will type it up. Sometimes people will even dictate it to themselves and play back the recording, or have, I think, Matt, you talked about having your computer read it back to you, right, as well. Yeah. And so these are all modes of reapprehending it. So we're not just relying upon what I've seen through my eyes, that one vision of seeing, but now I'm hearing it, I'm enunciating it, I'm embodying the text literally. And these are all ways, I think, of changing our relationship and defamiliarizing it so we can see something else within those pages.
Absolutely. I love that. Maybe we can have one more question before you guys read from your work. And this pertains to what you were just saying, Peter, is coming back to it and seeing it with new eyes and seeing it as a new reader. How long do you typically advise people to let a draft sit before you become that new reader or that new set of eyes? Peter, you want to maybe speak to that, and then we'll talk to Matt?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that I have a fixed time frame. I mean, the ideal is that you'll know you're ready when you can go back to it and you can see it differently. And I think there are ways of speeding that up. So some of those mechanical ideas of, I'm going to read it aloud, I'm going to listen back to it, that does that work. I often joke with my students that I think the shift in the re-seeing is sort of like switching out our eyes in a sense, right? So we were talking earlier about seeing our work through the eyes of its writer, and then begin to apprehend our work through the eyes of a potential reader. And obviously workshop tends to accelerate that. But I often say to students that that applies even before they get any feedback, right? So there's a classic moment where we hand out a story in workshop and we hit send when we're sending it around the group, or if we even send it off to a magazine, to an editor, or an agent. And as soon as we've sent it, or as long as we've handed it out, before we've heard a single word, before people have even read a word of it, we go, should have fixed that, right? There's something in the text that we realize, oh, I forgot to do that, I meant to do that, I really ought to do that. And that's a sort of instant intuitive reasoning or sense of other people's eyes on the text. So that's the beginning of that process, I think, where we see it through other eyes. And I think that's a really rapid accelerant of that sense of seeing it differently. When I work alone, often I think the time frame works like this. I work on something to the point at which I think it really sucks and I can't bear to look at it again. I close the file, put it in the desk drawer, can't bear to look at it. And then for the sake of argument, let's say 3 months, 6 months later, I'm working on something else. And that really sucks. And it's the worst ever. And I think, oh, that old thing wasn't quite as bad as I thought it was. Maybe I could salvage something from that space. And I should say, for me, revision is very much an active salvage and recovery and rescue in many ways. So that tends to send me back. And then if I'm lucky, partly because I've worked on something else and I've forgotten that old thing, what I meant by that thing, I'll see it with those new eyes again.
Oh, Matt, what do you think about
Yeah, I agree with everything Peter's saying. You know, I'm glad we have this debate where we just already agree about everything, which is it's really good. I think there is something really interesting about that place where you start feeling like this other thing you didn't finish is good. You know, I feel like halfway through every novel, I start looking at my old failed novels, and I'm like, I could write this book. This book was the good one. But you know, I've sort of lucked out the last two novels where I've written a short nonfiction book between drafts of the novel, which is not going to be everybody's path, but it's for me, it's just getting that space where I'm thinking about something else and the problems of something else. So when my novel Scrapper between drafts, I wrote a like 30,000 word book about the video game Baldur's Gate 2 for a press. And so I was switching between novel brain and sort of nonfiction brain. And then for Appleseed, I wrote Refuse to Be Done between drafts of Appleseed. So one thing you could do is you could write a book about revision between drafts or revising your novel, which is a reasonably good way of planning your revisions. I think I just need to be in a different space. And I think at the end of a novel draft, you're sort of, maybe at the beginning of a novel draft, you're sort of ideally like thinking about it every day in some way. Like I go out for a run in the morning, I'm already thinking about the book, like it's already there. The book has this like form of attention where everything I read or see in the world, I'm like, oh, that's part of my book, you know? And ideally, before I start the next draft, I want that to stop. That like it's no longer like my daily companion, so that I end up in that place Peter's talking about where I see it differently. And I'm thinking about something else and I have a different set of concerns. And so when I come back to the draft again, I'm not the person who finished it exactly. And I don't think it actually takes that long. It might be, you know, for me, I mean, it could be like a month is good. That's what I used to make myself wait a month. I'll say when I was in grad school, I was writing mostly short stories, and I just had this like write a draft, then write another first draft, then revise that first, you know, and so I got this like 3-story cycle of sort of like 3 drafts of revision. And that was an incredibly productive and enjoyable way to work.
Awesome. Would you like to read some of your work to us? I can transition to read from your work. So maybe we'll start with Matt.
Sure.
And then we'll transition to Peter.
Oh, thanks so much. I'm just going to read the beginning of my new novel, Appleseed. I don't think you have to know too much since it's the beginning, but I'll just say that for people who aren't familiar with it, it's like a 1,000-year-long novel. So it starts in 1799 and ends 1,000 years in the future. Takes place over like 3 timelines, one of which, the 1799 one, is a kind of mythological retelling of the Johnny Appleseed myth, if Johnny Appleseed was a faun out of Greek mythology. So the beginning of the book is Chapman and his brother Nathaniel returning to the Ohio Territory, where they're planning on planting apple trees again this year. So thank you so much. Chapman wakes in the cold and the dark and the wet pre-dawn slush to the sound of his brother Nathaniel, already up and tending to the sputtering ashes of last night's fire, cursing and shivering, huddled beneath his only blanket. Despite Nathaniel's ministrations, the coals beneath the ashes stay dead, the gathered wood wet, breakfast impossible. Shelling himself out from his bedroll, Chapman rises too, offering his brother a grunted good morning before stamping his cloven hooves against the frigid ground, trying to quicken blood sluggish with sleep. As first light breaks, he stalks silently away from their campsite, climbing the last ridge of this Pennsylvania mountain pass to watch the night's rainfall trickle off into morning mist, admiring the fine accidental melody of clean water falling branch to branch. A moment later, dutiful Nathaniel follows along, dragging their bags and tools to where Chapman waits upon his outcropping of rock, one clawed hand raised to shield his golden eyes as he surveys the forest they'll cross today, snowpack still jamming the forest shadows, sparkling ice coating its swampy glacial kettles and its irregular lakes, all this waiting beauty backlit now by the red shroud of sunrise, the new day's dawn setting aglow a vast world not yet fully explored. This brother, Nathaniel says, placing one calloused hand on taller Chapman's bare brown shoulder, waving the other out over the territory below. This is where we'll make our fortune. Pointing out the first landmarks they're due to pass today, he traces a path out of this mountain gap and down to the slim strand of tilled earth that gives entrance to the Ohio Territory, then the way beyond into the unsettled, unmapped forest swamps of the interior, past the river bottomlands and sheltered ravines where they sowed last year's nurseries, toward the next uninhabited acres where they'll aim to plant this year's seeds. As Nathaniel happily details his plan, Chapman smiles his much practiced smile, his sharp teeth sliding out from behind his broad lips. Look, brother, he interrupts, pointing out dim campfires barely visible through the morning mist, flickers of flame and smoke rising in far sheltered dales. There are so many more of us this year. Every year, these fires move deeper into the landscape, each one a distant sign of strangers come to expand the human mark, to put the land to what Nathaniel has taught Chapman are its rightful uses. Here are settlers hunting and trapping and gathering wild foodstuffs, cutting down trees and tearing up rocks to make room for placeholder farms, making way for the towns to come, while others tap trees for sap and hang tin sugaring buckets over hot coals, sometimes passing the time with amateur fiddling, the inviting sounds of their instruments carrying across even the most desolate, starless, moonless nights. Together, the brothers measure again the increasingly believable potential of this territory, its wilderness cleared by war, then emptied by treaty. As he has at the start of every other year's journey, Nathaniel tells Chapman again how this taken land can now be brought to heel by industrious men, how by many hands the foundations of a new civilization will be laid here, the land year by year made ready for the coming of more people, until one day the uncultivated earth gives way to what he says will surely be the grandest of cities, each graced by the tallest buildings and the widest avenues, all populated by an endless parade of hardy settlers planting horizon-busting fields of wind-tilted golden grain, harvesting fruitful orchards planted by these two forward-thinking brothers. Chapman and Nathaniel and these others gathered around their distant fires are only the first to come, he says. Even if our industries should fail entirely, Nathaniel concludes, surely we will not be the last. Nathaniel has said this for 10 years now, the same lines recited from the same mountain pass at the outset of each year's venture. It's time to go, Chapman says, suddenly impatient with his brother's story. He ties his bedroll and his tools over one bare shoulder, slings his leathern seed bag around the other. The morning air is chilled and damp, but the bark of his skin keeps him warm enough that even in winter he wears no shirt or coat, only a pair of trousers hacked off above his inhuman knees. He dusts the last of the night's frost from his flanks, then whinnies lowly, stretching tall to rub the smooth shells of his curved horn with his clawed hands, first his broken horn and then its intact twin for luck. Nathaniel laughs, then mimics his brother's superstitions, rubbing his own bare temples, where just recently a few gray hairs will start creeping through the brown. Meet you at the river, Nathaniel teases, sidestepping onto the narrow trace path leading down the ridgeline, if you can catch me. He rushes to build his slim head start, but his advantage doesn't last long. A moment later, Chapman surges past him to drop down the steep plunge of the mountainside, his hooves sliding precariously on loose scree as he picks up speed, the joy of moving fast, filling him from the inside out, his fur standing on end, his heart leaping with happy effort. He quickens his pace with every step until a barking cry rips free of him, the sound of his voice, foreign enough to this territory and every other to frighten all the nearby roosting birds into sudden startled flight, the gray sky filling with their black silhouettes, their many cries joining the whooping of this one fawn returned at last to wildest lands. Wherever Chapman ventures next, there waits some unnamed waterway or unexplored meadow, some ridge never described, never made anyone's landmark, or so he once believed, come late to this landscape, cleared of its most recent inhabitants. Now he just as frequently exits untouched woods to find newly planted lands, the forest brambles burned back, its glacier-spilled stones stacked into makeshift garden walls, so many trees felled to make rough sawn boards, boards nailed into unsound houses, held upright by mortar and tar and hope. New construction makes Chapman nervous, long in habitation doubly so. From his youngest days, he could follow a wooded trail haphazardly stamped flat, but couldn't abide a road cleared by men with picks and shovels and mules. He could skirt the edges of farms, but couldn't cross their fenced-in fields without his skin aching with hives, his bones burning in their sockets. Only after Nathaniel hit on the idea of planting frontier orchards did Chapman begin to better acculturate himself, their nurseries tucked amid their wilder cousins, easing his flesh toward the idea of the domesticated. Nathaniel stands of apple trees wild enough for Chapman to pass among them, as long as the trees are planted from seeds never grafted. By midday, Chapman reaches the river he seeks, the sun emerging over its clear, fast course, its waterline raised by snowmelt and spring rains. He squats over his hooves to scan the sparkling water for signs of trout coming up to feed on the gathering insects, hungry for their pleasurable slap and splash. Then picks the tick from his fur, squeezing the pin of its head with clawed fingers, the pressure not enough to kill it, but certainly to make it release. Waiting for Nathaniel, Chapman swings his bag around his bare frame, rests it above his bony knees. He pulls it open even though he shouldn't. The seeds could easily dry out despite the moist pumice and pulp. And then he plunges his head into the bag's opening, breathes deep the wet ferment inside. Around him are 1,000 fresher scents, all the territories, perfumes and poisons, promises and provocations. But Chapman's favorite is the one he carries lashed to his chest, kept contained within his satchel. Not the attractive smell of apples ready to be picked, not the smell becoming taste of an apple bitten, but this rotten, stinking hope, the intoxicating promise of what next. The tree, the tree, the tree. Taste and smell are almost the same sense, even in memory, even in dream. With his face buried in the leathern bag, Chapman imagines the taste smell of the apple of the tree. He tells himself it's possible to plant, to grow, to harvest one glowing apple from, one apple, all he'll need to change his life. Let Nathaniel make his fortune if he can. All Chapman wants is one particular apple. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much, Matt. I'll be asking each of you this same question after you read. I was thinking about revision, of course, and the beginnings of novels are very important. And of course, thinking about the section you just read, it's a very ambitious book, right? It's like historical fiction, futuristic, speculative, 3 timelines. How do you decide to enter into that world, and maybe think about how revision played a part in the beginning?
Sure. I really started with the idea of retelling Johnny Appleseed as a fun, which was partly inspired by Michael Pollan's The Botany of Desire, where he talks about the domestication of the apple. And I loved like Johnny Appleseed and those kind of American folktales as a kid. There's a Disney cartoon from like the 50s of Johnny Appleseed that was like a family favorite and things like that. But in Pollan's book, he talks about Johnny Appleseed and the real John Chapman, who that's based on, as like an American Dionysus. It was a Dionysian figure. And when I was listening to that, I was like, oh, wouldn't it be funny to do that as like a literal like Dionysian figure? So it started from this kind of stupid thought while running, and then, you know, became something else as it went. Some of the scale was a solution to a problem of, if I only wrote, and some of it's just, you know, things I cared about, like writing about climate change, the environment, and things that I wanted to do. But if the story had only taken place in 1799, it would have been really about this sort of like settler colonial project that the brothers were engaged in real life, and it would not be able to critique it in some way, because it would have been from inside that sort of framework. So one of the reasons for the long time span is so the other timelines can communicate with each other and talk. I think I'm always trying to find a way for the book to be smarter than the characters. You know, if you're locked into like the tunnel vision of a protagonist often, but the book doesn't have to be locked into that same tunnel. And so looking for the way that the book can be. As far as revision, I'll just say quickly, one of the problems I had early on was I didn't know if Nathaniel needed to be in the book. Like I sort of had Chapman, and I had, so Chapman, the real John Chapman was Nathaniel's older brother. He's the younger brother in my book. The Fawn is the younger brother. For reasons, I guess. But so he had this historical brother that he planted apple trees with. But I didn't know if my book needed him, and I kept writing him in and writing him out. But I learned this maybe from a grad student of mine when I was at Northern Michigan University, who ran into a similar problem where she had 2 characters where she needed one, and she was halfway through a draft. And she said, I think these people just need to be one person. I said, well, will you go back and fix it, or you keep going forward? She's like, I think I'm going to write forward as if I've already fixed it, which was so wise, right? The characters just became one person in the second half of the draft. And so I had less commitment than her, but I was writing scenes where Nathaniel existed, and then I would write as if he had never existed. And so my first draft was like haunted by this like brother that like did or did not sort of exist. And eventually I saw that they had different worldviews. So there were 2 different answers to this question of like, what's the right relation to land, or what's the, you know, what is the right relation to the non-human world? And that as their answers diverged, the relationship complicated. And so having them both there let me have this like kind of pure settler colonial manifest destiny in Nathaniel, and this liminal space between the human and the non-human with Chapman, and to put those things in conflict. But that took a year or two to figure out, right? And in the meantime, things were sort of in flux. And I think that's an interesting place to inhabit when you sort of don't know the answer to a question, but you're willing to write without knowing it.
Right. And kind of embracing the unknown is part of the process.
The whole game, maybe.
Peter, would you like to share your work with us?
Sure, yeah. God, that was a great reading, Matt. I loved hearing that section. And there's something about historical fiction that's always like a revisionary move, because we're taking the past and thinking into it, but to double down on that into that mythological space as well. It's like a revision squared. I love that. No, sure. I was thinking actually, as you were talking about the writing of Appleseed and Refuse to Be Done, and that sense of working on them both, simultaneously a little bit. I have not done that before, but I did that a little bit with The Art of Revision and my more recent novel, which I'm plugging up. Which book am I going to go? Oh yes, this one. A Lie Someone Told You About Yourself. They ended up being accidentally written a little bit simultaneously. So I'm going to read the very start of that book, which started actually, oddly enough, as a story that came out in 2012, and I probably wrote in 2008. And so, you can sort of see something about the longevity of a project. The book doesn't show up until about 2021. So this is the beginning. I think it's fairly self-explanatory. The section is called Chance. There was a chance the baby was normal. There was a chance the baby was not. Fetus, he told himself. There was a chance the fetus was normal. There was a chance that it was not. She, he told himself. That was the result of one of the tests on the fetus. There was a chance that she was normal. There was a chance that she was not. Jesus. No one could tell him the exact odds. There was a small chance the baby was normal, a tiny chance, BB-sized, no bigger than a bean, and there was a large chance she was not, a full-grown, adult-sized chance, big as a whale, big as a house. Stretch marks, his wife said, gazing at the pregnant women across the waiting room like distant mountains. That's what I used to be afraid of. The chances of what was wrong with the baby being wrong with the baby had been 1,000,000 to 1 before the test, except there was still that tiny chance it was wrong. 1,000,000 to 1 was a figure of speech. He knew the condition so rare there were no reliable statistics. It was so rare the genetic counselor hesitated to put a number on it. But if you press me, 50 or 60 cases worldwide ever. So rare that even after a positive test, the doctors couldn't be sure the baby had it, but they thought so. He was a writer now, this father, but he had studied physics once, the science of the unimaginably vast and the unimaginably small, as one of his professors boasted. And still, the numbers meant nothing to him. Unimaginable. He didn't like that word. As a writer, had a professional dislike of it. Sometimes he wondered if the baby would grow up to be a scientist, if the baby might make sense of the numbers. What would the baby say in his place? What would the baby decide? The list of things the baby might have was 4 pages long, single-spaced. The list was not numbered. When he cried and stared at it, blurred, it looked like poetry, free verse, short lines, long lines, run-on lines. He couldn't make any more sense of it than language poetry. He would start to read, and a page in or less, his mind would drift. Perhaps the baby would be a poet. He felt proud of himself that he wanted the baby to be smarter than him, better than him. There was a chance the baby would be a poet or a scientist. There was a chance it would die in the womb, live a few hours or days or months in pain, unimaginable pain. It was June. The due date was December 7th, a date which will live in infancy, they joked. Then it was July. Chances are it's not hereditary, the genetic counselor cancelled them. She deftly drew the elongated chromosomes upside down on a pad between them. More likely a spontaneous mutation, a random copying error during meiosis, cell division. He nodded rapidly. He wanted to tell her he used to be a scientist. A freak, he agreed, and her face, radiant with concern, flickered. Just bad luck, she said, with the infinite care of diagnosis. Very bad luck. There was a daycare center down the street. He jogged past it every day. The kids in the little playground, they'd thought it would be convenient, his wife and he. Lucky, they'd said. They'd been used to thinking of themselves as lucky until a couple of years earlier. They'd just bought their first house, taken a week to unpack, hung the last pictures, shelved the last books, gone away for the weekend. A pipe had burst, a $1.99 plastic tube running into the base of the toilet tank. When they came home, water was running from the light fixture onto the dining table like a fountain. Water was running down the bulging walls. It was running behind the paint like veins. For days, they watched dark brown seams spread across the ceiling. He'd felt like it was God's fault. He'd felt as if it had been hubris to buy a house. It was the worst thing that had ever happened to them in their life together. And yet months later, when they had a much nicer house, they'd kidded each other. Thank God for insurance. They'd wanted the house to start a family. They'd worried about a child drawing on the bright new walls. He didn't fault God for the baby. He didn't believe in him, couldn't imagine him. The numbers were too big. They dwarfed God. They couldn't know. No one could. So they decided, this mother and father, someone had to, and in the absence of God, it was them. They waited as long as they could. They waited for more tests. They waited with hope, but not hope of good news. The later tests couldn't refute the old ones. The best the new tests could do was confirm the worst. So that is what they found themselves hoping for as they held hands, the worst. Do you ever wish we hadn't done any tests? He asked her, and she squeezed his hand so tightly he felt the bones must fuse. The tests were inconclusive, so they had decided anyway. And that was all months ago. The baby would have been born by now. They'd have taken the baby home from the hospital by now. The baby's grandparents would have visited by now. The baby would be smiling by now. Months ago, they were licking their wounds. They were gardening for the first time in their lives, the sunlight heavy on their shoulders and necks. They were starting to tell people they might try again, trying out the idea of trying again, the words ashy on their tongues. They told their friends, the ones who, even though they knew the truth, said encouraging things like, so-and-so had a miscarriage, they tried again. Once in bed, his wife had whispered to him, I wish we'd had a miscarriage. It was just a thing people did, he knew. By the kind of chance he was growing numb to, the rhetorical figure was known as meiosis, calling one thing something else, something safer. It made his wife furious, but to him it seemed only human, as if the events, the circumstances, so rare, so unheard of, shouldn't have a name. Perhaps in 10 years, he thought, it's what we'll say. We had a miscarriage. It seemed so easy to spare themselves explaining it again over and over. Perhaps it was what they'd even say to another child if they had another child. And then he knew it was what they'd say, because how could you say what really happened to a child, your own child, if you had another child? Cars with pro-life bumper stickers were everywhere on the roads that election year. 93% of women regret their abortion. If Mary was pro-choice, there'd be no Christmas. What part of thou shalt not kill don't you understand? His wife tailed one to a convenience store, followed the driver, a woman inside. I wanted to tell her how she made me feel. I was going to, and I saw her at the register. You know what she was buying? Lotto tickets. They laughed until they cried. The next week he saw one that read, the number of the beast, 50 million abortions, and found himself, despite himself, coldly comforted. For once the numbers seemed with him. Will you write about it? His wife asked. It was his way of making sense. You can if you want. But he didn't know how to make a story of it. The odds were too long, the case too special. People would only believe it if it was true. Non-fiction then. He shook his head so slightly it felt like a shiver. It's too shameful, he whispered. No, not that, he called after her. Too shameful to be this unlucky, I mean. He stared at the white of the walls, ashamed and ashamed of his own shame. If he ever did write the story, he thought there was a chance that it would be true, a chance that it would be not. A story, at least, could be both. He rejoined his poker game. Not a game of chance, he knew, but now when he lost a hand, the winner apologized. Bad beat, man. The next week, he started playing online. He'd always been a good player, good with numbers from his physics days, but he played badly now. Drew to inside straights, chased cards. He figured he was due some luck. But when he told his wife, when she saw the bills, she said, do you think that'd make up for it? You think that'd make it better? And he quit. But he could tell she thought they were due something too. There was a chance the baby was normal, he told himself. There was a chance the baby was not. Even now, they didn't know for sure, but they could if they wanted. Somebody did. Somebody somewhere in a white coat in a lab. There had been more tests afterwards, post. Finally, the definitive tests could be done. They had agreed to them. If it helps science, they said, if it might help other parents someday, if some good could come out of this. There were results to these tests, and they were conclusive, and they were out there in some file, just waiting to be asked for. Whenever you want to know, or never, the genetic counselor told them. Were they those other parents now? Was it someday? They talked about trying again, but they didn't. Trying again, she said, just didn't feel like anything they'd ever tried before. Instead, they talked about the results, whether they wanted them. They could decide about the results. They couldn't decide about the results. They could decide about the baby, but they couldn't decide about the results. It felt like a cruelty, but the results existed. It felt like someone out there with a gun. They had agreed about everything, but now sometimes they disagreed. She wanted the results, and he didn't, just as once and for a year or two she'd wanted a child and he hadn't. Perhaps she thought he'd come around again. Someone knows, she said, some doctor, some technician. If they know, I want to know. It was the same argument she'd used when talking about finding out the baby's sex. It had made sense to him then. I can't bear it, she said, the not knowing. How can you bear it? He had been a scientist, could have been one. It was the path not taken. At parties, he used to joke that he was a lapsed physicist, a bit like being a lapsed Catholic. They still feel guilt, I still feel gravity. All he remembered of his physics now was the uncertainty principle and the famous thought experiment about Schrodinger's cat. The cat in a box with a vial of poison, the poison be released by a random radioactive decay. According to the physics, the decay might or might not have happened until the physicist looked in the box. Only then, only when observed, would the cat be either dead or alive. He was thinking, of course, of the baby in the box, wriggling, squirming, heart racing, the gray, grainy baby from the ultrasound that his wife still had somewhere in the house, not exactly hidden away, but put somewhere he wouldn't stumble upon, somewhere he'd have to ask her where it was, as if she were protecting it from him. When he imagined having sex with his wife again, he pictured the milky ghost of his penis entering her swirling, snowy womb, as if on the monitor at the doctor's office. It looked very cold in there. He thought of the results. If they got them, the baby would be normal or the baby would not. Issue settled, but he couldn't do it, couldn't ask for the tests. All he could think of was the old physics line. How can you know the fate of Schrodinger's cat without looking in the box? Throw it in the river. If it floats, the cat's a witch. He wanted that box to stay shut. But why, his wife implored. He couldn't tell her. Why, like steps receding. Not because if the baby was normal, it would make things worse, though it would, but because even if the baby wasn't, it wouldn't make things better. He didn't want to be relieved of the shame when it was all he could feel, all he was allowed to, all he was left to remember her by. That was why. Because the baby was already dead. There was a chance the baby was normal. There was a chance, tiny and miraculous, that they had killed their baby. It was a thing about numbers, he thought for years after. The chance of a flipped coin coming up heads 100 times is a half times a half times a half, 100 times. Astronomical. But on one flip, the first or the hundredths, the chances of heads are still just 50-50. The coin doesn't care how it's fallen 99 times before. The coin doesn't give a fuck. That's what it is to be random. That's what chance is. Thank you.
Oh, amazing. Thank you so much, Peter. Actually, while I was listening to that, my follow-up is thinking about the moment where the narrator is considering, like, maybe I should write about this. Can I write about this? Is it too big or too close? And I'm thinking that's probably a struggle that all writers go through. And I'm curious about how your approach, because you are yourself writing about a very, very touchy emotional issue. So what are the struggles with that, and how do you know what is writable?
Yeah, that's a great question. Oh, my cat has just come to visit as well.
Out of the box.
Yes, want to say hi? Yeah. Just to lighten the mood a little bit. I think, especially with the novel that sort of sprung from this story, one of the things that oddly enabled it was that question of how do I write about this, and am I allowed to write about this? Can I write about this? which I was very aware of as I was doing it for lots of reasons. Partly I was under contract to write another collection of stories, so this sort of grew out of a story, but it became this thing that I wasn't supposed to be writing. But it also felt the material is fictional, but drawn from life. It's in that sort of weird liminal space of autofiction, I suppose, in some ways. I was wary of writing about myself and my wife and my child, and to some degree was very content to give my wife veto power. If you don't think this should see the light of day, that's absolutely fine. And so for a long time, I wrote the book with a sense of, I don't know what it is. I don't know if it'll actually be long enough to be a novel. I don't know if other people will say you shouldn't publish this. And strangely, that was freeing. That sense that I'm not sure it'll ever see the light of day was the thing that allowed me to write into some of those spaces, I think, in various ways. So the uncertainty in the book is very much about uncertainty, about even what it was or whether it would ever be read, was oddly, surprisingly freeing.
Matt, do you have some thoughts on that as well? Like thinking about writing from real life or writing from, big issues, and how do you, or different cultures or anything like that, and how do you wrestle with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what Peter was just saying about the uncertainty of the questions of that actually being freeing or at least animating, right? Like I don't know that I always feel freed by it, but I do think there's some freedom in like as you said, knowing this might never see the light of the day, like free to do something. I immediately thought of like things in the novel I'm writing now that I know that's the case. That I know if I was writing it for even like to show to my agent or my editor or something, that I would flinch from it if I thought they were going to see it, which is a weird thing you do as you're writing, right? There's this sort of, well, working as hard as you can to write a book other people will enjoy, you pretend no one else will ever try to enjoy it. So that seems really right to me, that there is, I mean, I think I make a big distinction between the parts of the process that feel like they're for me and the parts that feel like they're for the reader. You know, Peter was talking at the beginning about how you can't see revision really when you're reading finished books, and so it's hard to learn about. I talk a lot about with students about like at the library, the bookstore, at our own homes, you know, like you can learn what a novel does, but you can't learn how a novel was made, like from reading, for the most part. You know, some books leave their scaffold up a little bit, but I don't know. I find that actually kind of exciting, that the place before the public ask for a reader is mine, and I wait a really long time before I share. Like I think I share less than most people do, and it does give me this kind of interesting zone where I'm thinking really hard about something that's just for me. And I think that's even kind of a way that's like against the dominant mode of our culture, right? That everything should be productive, everything should have a purpose, everything should, you know, produce revenue or whatever it is, you know. And I think most of my process is really just me trying to think my own thoughts and feel my own feelings and engage my own sense of wonder and play. And in many ways, that's the best part. It's certainly the part that feels the most gratifying personally. And I think the longer you can inhabit that, or the more fully you can sort of engage with that part of the process, the more interesting place you get.
You're reminding me, Matt, that there's a, you know, I often remind myself that some part of what we're doing is trying to say the unsayable, right? Yeah. And I think there's moments where I think I'm not sure I can show this to anybody. I'm not sure I should say this to anybody. Right. Those are moments of heat, right? So the things that make me very anxious about those things are also a reminder there's something there, there's some power, there's some vulnerability. And the sharing of that vulnerability feels like it goes somewhere to that intimacy of the reader-writer relationship, I think, in some ways. But I'm also thinking, this maybe goes back to revision in a strange way. Although because this book was sort of underway when I was writing the revision book, I don't really draw any examples from it directly when I'm talking about revision in the craft book. There is this weird thing that, you know, this goes back to your question, Mark, about sort of writing it, sharing it. And there was a lengthy spell between first writing this in about 2008 before sending it out and seeing it in print in 2012. I think I showed it to my wife once. In that period of time. And I knew there was something there because it made her cry, which, you know, you don't want to do, but also, you know, okay, there's something, we're hitting something there. But I think part of the delay in sending it out wasn't really a revisionary one in a kind of changing things way. It was a delay of that re-seeing, coming to understand why it was so it was. I think one of the things that lurked for me in my mind for a long time was this feels intuitively the right way to tell it. This odd auto-fictional, the character's a writer. Oh, yeah, okay. How uneasy do I feel about that space, that sharing? Because it's inviting people to project. Oh, is it fiction? Is it non-fiction? Is it memoir? Is it fiction? And I was uneasy about that, even though it felt intuitively right. And then I think I was at a seminar somewhere. I shared this with a couple of my colleagues. And in the midst of that conversation, it came to me that uncertainty about what the nature of the piece is, memoir, fiction, that readerly uncertainty of, is this real, is it made up, or what's the admixture of those two things, that was making me quite uneasy and felt like an unconscious choice, just where the work had taken me. I think I realized finally that felt right for the piece, because in a way that readerly uncertainty is an analog for the character's own uncertainty about the diagnosis they're going through in some ways as well. And that, I'd like to say I planned that, but it's not that my writer brain did that. So my reader brain go, oh, that's why that's like that. But at a certain point, it was that feeling that I understood why the story was the way it was. And then, even though I didn't change anything, the story was changed for me, and I felt it was done, and I was able to send it out with a kind of confidence that I might not have had prior to that sort of understanding of it. So that's a revision process that doesn't change any language. It's a weird way of thinking into that, right?
Yeah. Let's see. We have a couple questions before we take off from our audience. One is thinking about process, and it says, I would love to hear both of you talk about us chronic procrastinators and how we can build a healthy relationship with revision. How to make revision a consistent part of one's writing practice, even if you struggle to finish even the early drafts. So I guess thinking about generating versus revision, do you have some healthy advice for our procrastinators? Matt, do you want to start us off maybe?
Yeah. Obviously without knowing the person who wrote it, the reasons for procrastination can be sort of different. One of the things I see a lot in my own grad students who I teach a novel writing workshop here, which means students frequently do start novels as thesis projects, in which I'm often working on. And I see over and over, like really great, really smart MFA students get to like the 90% point on a draft and then refuse to finish it. And part of it is because if they, December of their third year, they've got 20 pages to go. And like on March of the third year, they've got 20 pages to go. And I'm like, write the end of your book. But I know part of the procrastination is like, the closer you get to the end, the more you have to confront what you've made. And I think Peter was talking about this at the beginning of our hour. And if you don't finish it, you don't have to confront it. And there's like this weird, and the first draft isn't meant to be perfect. We know that, but there's like sometimes, and I think in the middle of a first draft, you tend to have like a mess, and it's hard, so it's okay. So I think that can be part of that procrastination, is you have to sort of deal with the thing you've made if you finish it. I guess I'll say, before I try to say something about revision, I really think if you're writing like your first novel, even if it's like going terribly, writing a like beginning, middle, and end will do more for your future as a writer than like anything else you can do. You just only hitting that 75% or 90% steps and starting over doesn't let you know that you can write a novel length manuscript. And I think like making it to the end, even if it's hard or even if you don't necessarily want to anymore, it has value. Those two novels I wrote before I went to grad school were terrible books, but they made me know I could type 60,000 words in a document and have a beginning, middle, and end, right? And knowing that will protect you in the future when things are hard. As far as procrastinating in revision, I think revision is always hard to get started. That sort of retyping process I talked about, it is not super enjoyable like day one. I'm always like, why am I retyping this bad book into a new document? But I think, like any kind of habit or practice, the more, you don't have to write every day, everybody has a different routine, but like the more you're in your sort of groove, whatever your routine is, the less procrastination, I think, even becomes a question. Like, I think the time you're meant to be doing that stuff that you made in your life will just be activated by doing that. So I think if you feel like procrastination is a constant problem, then maybe there's like a habit that needs to be formed that will enable procrastination not really to be the question, which is not to say that I don't spend all my time screwing around on Twitter or something too. I mean, like, procrastination is real, but there are ways to like make it less prevalent.
So your grad student really truly refused to be done.
Yeah, like it happens often enough with novel writing grad students that am trying to find like the best way to short circuit them on that fear, which I don't know I have. It really does happen every year.
Yeah, I call that Scheherazade revision, right? There
Yeah.
is a fear of like always putting off the death-like judgment of the final draft.
Right.
I mean, there are lots of procrastination strategies, of course, and I'm certainly prone to many of them. And the thing I tend to do, I think one sticking point is often when people share a work in a workshop, even a very good workshop, they get tons of feedback. They just don't know where to begin. So they get stuck in that place. So I've taken, in fact, with students of making them turn in a revision back to me alone just 2 weeks later, which is a ridiculously short period of time.
Yeah, that's great.
And obviously, it also means they're not going to fix everything, which actually is a great lesson because they shouldn't try to fix everything in one go. And when they come in, I'll meet with them usually the week after workshop just to talk about what they're thinking about, how they're thinking moving into that revision space. And we talk about a couple of things to lower the bar of entry into revision. The first is just to fix the easy stuff, right? All the things that you know, I agree with that, I can do that, it could be grammatical, it could be easy. But then the second thing is just what's not the things you think you ought to do, the things that you think we want you to do. What's the most fun thing to change in the story? What's the thing that you're excited about? I know you talk a little bit about this as well, Matt, in the book. Yeah. And then I think that makes it feel not like a chore that's imposed by somebody else, but a route towards discovery and excitement. And those two things, I think, get people in the door of revision much faster than if they just stand there going, I can't know which of these things do I do first, the things I ought to do, the things I'd like to do. They just get stuck in that frozen space. You get them to do easy and then fun. And that kind of answers the question, I think, in some ways, because actually the fun stuff might even obviate the difficult stuff you don't want to do. The thing may take a different turn. You may not have to fix those other problems, actually. You may have actually found a route around them.
If I can add one quick thing to that made Peter's like sort of breaking out this list of things to do made me think of, I sometimes trying to figure out what to revise and revising at the same time is overwhelming. So I keep often, especially late in a first draft, when I know what some of the problems that are happening in the book that I'm going to have to fix in a second, I just keep a little like hit list of tasks. I'm like, you're going to need to go through and you're going to fix, like, you know, make sure everybody's eye colors are the same thing, or you're going to need to fix that one part. But like looking at the manuscript and trying to revise at the same time is overwhelming. But waking up and sitting on my writing time and looking at my action item list and being like, okay, today I have enough time to tackle this one, or this one seems interesting to me. Or I still don't really know the answer to that, but I know I have to do it. So, but evaluating and working at the same time are not the same brain, and it's really hard to do for me.
No. And then you also get to choose tasks that are scaled for the time, right? I think when I had my son and he was a baby, revision was a task that would fit within the 40 minutes of his napping period.
Right.
That was perfect, right? So you know you can't do everything. You just choose a task that you think you can address in that time frame. Yeah, I like that.
Well, our Q&A has now suddenly blown up, but we are pretty much out of time, and I know you guys have important things on the horizon. So I just want to reiterate that we have books available for Matt, Refuse to Be Done. We have a few copies if you would like one. Contact me, email me. We can send them anywhere, so just let me know. Peter has excerpts from his latest book available online, and you should go purchase it anyway, because it's like fascinating and super helpful. So I just want to thank you guys both for spending the hour with us and giving such insightful advice. Thank you so much.
Such a pleasure. Thanks so much for the invitation again, Mark. Matt, just a pleasure. We'll do this in person one of these days.
Yeah, sounds great. Absolutely. Pleasure to see both of you again. And thanks for being here, all the enthusiasm. It's really a pleasure to get to talk to you all today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.